The rain was falling softly outside the classroom window that morning, tapping against the glass like a quiet rhythm. Inside, the air felt heavy. The teacher stood at the front of the room, holding a marker that had almost dried out, staring at the rows of students who weren't really looking back. Some were whispering, some were laughing. A few were staring at their phones under the desks, pretending they were listening. It wasn't the first time this had happened. In fact, this was how most mornings looked now. When this teacher started a few years ago, there had been a fire in their heart. They used to believe they could make a difference, that teaching wasn't just about books or lessons, but about changing lives. But slowly, that belief had started to fade. It wasn't one big thing that broke it. It was the small things, the way students stopped paying attention, the way test scores dropped no matter how hard they tried, the way parents complained instead of helping, the way other teachers, once warm and supportive, now gave polite smiles and quiet pity. Standing in front of the class now, they could almost hear their own heartbeat louder than the students' voices. They cleared their throat, hoping to get some attention. A few heads lifted for a moment, then went right back down. "All right," the teacher said softly, trying again. "Let's start." Their voice sounded thinner than it used to. There was a time when it could fill the whole room. Now it barely reached the back row. As they wrote on the board, the sound of chairs scraping and pens clicking filled the room. It wasn't anger that burned inside anymore. It was something duller, heavier. Disappointment, not just in the students, but in themselves. They could feel it every day when they locked the classroom after everyone left and sat alone at their desk. Some teachers around the school still had that spark. You could see it in the way they walked into their classrooms like they belonged there. But this teacher felt like a guest in a place that used to feel like home. At lunch, they often sat alone in the staff room now. In the beginning, they had tried to join conversations, share stories, laugh about the little things. But after a while, it became easier to stay quiet. The others had their groups, their energy, their ideas. They just felt tired. And the worst part was, they couldn't remember when that feeling had started. That day after class, as students packed their bags and rushed out the door, the teacher stayed still for a moment, watching the last few leave. Most of them didn't even say goodbye. They never really did. But one student caught their eye. A quiet one, always sitting near the back. Never loud, never rude. Just invisible in a way. He moved slowly, carefully putting his notebook in his bag. While the others shouted and shoved each other in the hallway, he walked out without a sound. It wasn't anything special, but in a room full of noise, quietness stood out. Over the next few days, things didn't magically get better. The lessons still felt like a struggle. Every morning started the same way, with the teacher taking a deep breath before opening the classroom door, trying to push away the sinking feeling in their chest. The students didn't notice. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, the result was the same. The teacher spent late nights at their desk at home, staring at lesson plans that felt empty. Once, these plans had excited them. They had filled the margins with ideas and little doodles. Now they just made copies of old worksheets. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this anymore, they thought. It was the first time they had ever said it to themselves that way, and it hurt more than they expected. One Friday afternoon, something happened that they didn't expect. It was a small thing, almost easy to miss. Class had just ended. The teacher was gathering papers, their mind already halfway out the door. The students rushed past as always, leaving behind empty chairs, gum wrappers, and the faint smell of perfume and sweat. But that same quiet student lingered at the back of the room. He walked slowly toward the teacher's desk. At first, they thought he had a question about homework, but he didn't say a word. He held out a folded piece of paper. The teacher hesitated, then took it. The boy gave a small nod and walked out before they could even ask anything. The classroom fell silent. The teacher stood alone, the paper warm in their hand. Carefully, they opened it. It wasn't a homework question. It wasn't anything complicated at all. It was just a few lines written in slightly shaky handwriting. "Thank you for teaching us. I don't talk much, but I like your class. You make things easier to understand." That was it. No big speech. No dramatic moment. Just a few honest words from someone who had never said anything before. The teacher stared at the paper for a long time. Something in their chest shifted, like a window that had been closed for too long, letting in a little bit of fresh air. After weeks of feeling invisible, this small note felt like a light had been switched on in a dark room. They sat down at the desk and read the note again. And again. It wasn't that it solved everything, but it reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. They mattered to someone. Even if it was just one student, even if it was quiet, even if it was simple. That night when they got home, they didn't toss their bag in the corner like they usually did. They sat at the table with a notebook and a pen. They didn't copy old worksheets this time. They started to write something new. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. But for the first time in months, they actually wanted to teach again. Monday morning came, and the same tapping rain greeted them at the classroom door. But something was different inside them. They stood straighter. Their voice didn't shake when they said, "Good morning." Most students still didn't respond. A few kept talking, but one pair of quiet eyes looked up from the back of the room. That was enough. They started the lesson with a story instead of a formula. A simple, real story. Some students lifted their heads. One or two actually put their phones down. It wasn't a miracle. The room wasn't suddenly perfect, but it was different. Just slightly. And that slight difference was enough to keep going. In the middle of the lesson, a few kids made jokes at the back. Normally, that would have crushed their focus. But this time, they smiled and carried on. Because now, when they looked at the quiet student, they remembered that not everyone was ignoring them. Someone was listening. Someone cared. And sometimes one person is all it takes to keep a light from going out completely. As the week went on, the teacher didn't expect instant change. But they started noticing small things. A few more students started paying attention. A couple of them even answered questions. And every time their voice wavered, they thought about that note folded neatly in the drawer of their desk. It was still there. It would stay there for a long time. The truth was, the teacher had been measuring their worth by the noise in the room, by the chaos, by the ones who didn't care. But it was the quiet ones, the unnoticed ones, who sometimes carried the real moments of meaning. They just hadn't been looking in the right place. One evening, after everyone had left, the teacher stood alone in the empty classroom. The sun was setting, painting a warm light across the desks. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt calm, peaceful. The note was still in their bag. They reached for it and smiled without even realizing they were doing it. No one around them would know what changed. It wasn't something they could explain easily. It wasn't about teaching tricks or discipline strategies, it was about a reminder. A reminder that sometimes hope doesn't come in loud cheers or applause. Sometimes it comes in a folded piece of paper handed by someone too shy to speak. They looked around the classroom. The same walls, the same desks, the same students would be back tomorrow. But they wouldn't walk in as the same teacher. Something had quietly shifted, and though no one else knew it yet, this was the beginning of something new. The next week began with the same gray clouds hanging low over the school. The teacher walked through the hallways, their footsteps echoing, feeling a little lighter than before. Something small had shifted inside them, a spark they hadn't felt in months. But the spark was fragile, and they knew it. It wouldn't last if it wasn't nurtured. When they entered the classroom, most students filed in the same way they always did, rushing, laughing, trying to avoid eye contact. But the quiet student was already there, sitting at his usual spot near the back, his notebook open and a pencil ready. When he noticed the teacher, he gave a small nod. That tiny gesture made the teacher smile more than anything had in weeks. They started the lesson a little differently that day. Instead of going straight to the textbook, they asked a question, a simple one about something everyone could relate to. Most of the students ignored it, murmuring to each other. But the teacher noticed something. The quiet student was thinking. His pencil moved across the page. Not fast, not messy, but steady, deliberate. There was a focus there that reminded the teacher why teaching could still matter. As the week went on, they began noticing other small things too. The quiet student didn't talk much, but he listened. He remembered details from earlier lessons that other students forgot in minutes. He paid attention to instructions and, when asked, could repeat the answers clearly. Slowly, the teacher realized that while the classroom felt chaotic most of the time, there was a thread of patience, a calmness, weaving through it. And it came from him. One day, the teacher decided to try something new. They asked students to work in pairs on a simple writing exercise. Normally, this would have been met with groans, excuses, and eye rolls. But when the teacher suggested it, the quiet student quietly slid his notebook toward the empty chair next to him. One of the more restless students, a boy who liked to joke and tease, hesitated. The quiet student looked up, smiled faintly, and simply said, "We can work together." The other boy, unsure at first, accepted. It was the first time the teacher noticed a subtle shift in the classroom energy. The quiet student didn't speak loudly or demand attention, but his calm presence began to influence others. Slowly, the chaotic chatter dropped a little. Conversations were quieter, focused more on the task. The teacher walked around the classroom, quietly observing, trying not to interrupt, and felt a cautious sense of hope. That afternoon, the teacher stayed after school to gather papers. They were tired, of course, but it was a different kind of tired, less like defeat, more like effort. They were used to leaving the school feeling hollow, as if they had spent the day in a storm without any shelter. But now, even with some students still challenging, the storm felt less heavy. The quiet student stayed behind that day, too. The teacher expected him to leave like he always did once the bell rang. But instead, he approached slowly, holding his notebook. "I finished the exercise," he said softly. "Do you want to see it?" The teacher took the notebook, glanced at the page, and was surprised. The student had written thoughtfully, clearly explaining his ideas. There was care in every sentence, and more than that, there was understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was impressive. "This is very good," the teacher said quietly. "I can see you worked hard." The boy nodded and smiled faintly before leaving. That small acknowledgement, that simple interaction, stayed with the teacher long after the student had gone. For the first time in a long while, they realized that teaching wasn't just about keeping control of the room or chasing perfect grades. It was about connecting, even in small ways, with the students who were willing to listen and learn. Over the next few days, the teacher experimented more. Instead of strict rules and constant corrections, they tried asking questions, letting students explain their thoughts, even if the answers weren't perfect. They noticed that the quiet student was always ready, listening carefully, then sharing his ideas in a calm, clear way. Slowly, other students began to notice too. Some started listening more. Others began trying to participate, even if it was just a little. One afternoon, during a history lesson, the teacher asked the class to imagine what life was like in another country hundreds of years ago. Most students groaned, some whispered, but the quiet student's hand went up. When called on, he shared an idea that surprised everyone, a simple, clear observation about how people might have lived. The teacher felt a quiet thrill. It wasn't just that he knew the answer. It was that he was willing to speak, to put himself out there in front of the class. After the lesson, the teacher couldn't stop thinking about it. They realized that sometimes the students who seem invisible are actually watching, learning and growing in ways that aren't obvious. They just needed the right moment, the right encouragement to shine. Later that week, the teacher decided to try something a little riskier. They asked the students to write a short story and then share it with the class if they wanted. Normally, this would have caused panic. Some students hate speaking in front of others, but to the teacher's surprise, several hands went up. First the quiet students, then a few others. When the quiet student read his story, the classroom went silent. His words weren't fancy, but they were thoughtful. He described a small, simple moment, a memory from home, a fleeting thought, but he told it with care. The teacher watched the other students. They were listening, really listening. It wasn't perfect. There were small giggles, small whispers, but the energy in the room had shifted. After he finished, the teacher smiled. "Thank you," they said softly. That was very meaningful. The quiet student nodded, barely smiling, and sat down. It was a small victory, but in a classroom that had felt impossible, it felt huge. The teacher started noticing other changes too. Students who had once ignored instructions were paying attention. Conversations were calmer. Participation was increasing slowly but surely. And it wasn't just because of the teacher's strategies. It was the quiet student too. His example, his steady focus, his willingness to try, was changing the classroom from the inside out. One afternoon, the teacher stayed late, reviewing lesson plans. They were tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in their work. They realized that hope didn't come in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it came quietly, patiently, from someone who believed in them, even in a small way. They thought about the note the student had given them weeks ago. It had sparked this change, even if the student didn't realize it. The teacher decided to try something new the next day. They prepared an exercise that asked students to work in small groups and solve a problem together. Normally, this would have ended in chaos, but the quiet student had other plans. He quietly approached one of the students who struggled to work with others and offered, "Let's work together." Slowly, the groups formed. The classroom was still lively, but the energy was different. Instead of fighting or ignoring each other, students were talking, sharing ideas, helping one another. And at the center of it, the quiet student sat calmly, guiding without force, listening without judgment. By the end of the week, the teacher could see a real difference. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments when they felt like giving up. But now there was a reason to keep trying. The quiet student had reminded them what teaching could really be. About connection, about patience, about noticing the small moments that others might miss. As the teacher packed up their bag on Friday afternoon, they realized something important. They hadn't solved every problem. They hadn't won over every student, but they had found hope again. And sometimes hope was enough to keep going, to keep showing up, to keep believing that change was possible. The quiet student had done something remarkable. Not by speaking loudly or demanding attention, not by perfect answers or flashy skills. He had simply cared. He had listened. He had been willing to try. And in doing so, he had changed everything, not just for himself, but for the teacher and eventually for the entire classroom. That weekend, the teacher didn't just review lesson plans. They reflected on what had happened. They realized that this was the beginning of a journey. A quiet journey, yes, but a meaningful one. And they felt ready. Ready to meet the students Monday morning, ready to try again, and ready to believe that even one small person could make a huge difference. The quiet student didn't know it yet, but he had become the heart of the classroom. And in doing so, he had reminded the teacher why they became a teacher in the first place. The Monday morning after that weekend felt different. The teacher walked into the classroom with a quiet sense of purpose. They weren't expecting miracles, nothing had changed overnight, but there was a small confidence that hadn't been there before. The quiet student was already at his usual seat near the back, notebook open, pencil in hand. He looked up briefly, gave a faint nod, and went back to his writing. The teacher smiled. The lesson began with a question instead of a lecture. What do you notice in your world that others often ignore? The room was restless, of course. Some students groaned, some whispered, some tapped their pencils impatiently. But the teacher noticed a subtle difference. The quiet student raised his hand, not in a demanding way, but with a calm certainty. When called on, he spoke clearly, thoughtfully, and even the ones in the back row turned slightly to listen. The teacher realized something important. It wasn't just about the student who raised his hand. It was about the example he set. One small act of participation, one simple demonstration of focus and care was contagious. Slowly, others began to sit up straighter. Slowly, others began to pay attention. It wasn't perfect. Some still whispered and fidgeted. But the energy in the room had shifted just enough to feel different. That week, the teacher began trying new approaches inspired by the quiet student. Instead of giving instructions to the whole class at once, they started checking in with small groups. They asked questions that required thinking, not memorization. They encouraged students to explain their ideas to each other. At first, some students resisted, whispering and rolling their eyes. But the quiet student remained steady, participating in every exercise, listening carefully, and helping guide the others without bossing them around. During a reading exercise, The teacher noticed something remarkable. A group of students had been arguing over an interpretation of a story, voices rising, tempers flaring. Usually the teacher would have stepped in immediately, trying to calm them down. But this time the quiet student raised his hand, not to speak over them, but to suggest a compromise. He said softly, "Maybe we can each share our idea and then pick the part we all agree on first." The teacher watched in awe as the students actually listened. The argument softened, the voices lowered, and slowly they began to work together. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements. But instead of the teacher having to intervene constantly, the quiet student had guided them toward cooperation. By midweek, the classroom felt different in ways that couldn't be measured with grades or test scores. Students were talking to each other more respectfully. They were listening when someone spoke. They were trying, even when they didn't have to. The teacher felt something they hadn't felt in months, a sense of pride and possibility. One day, the teacher brought in a new project, a group assignment that required teamwork and creativity. Usually, group projects were chaotic. Students argued about roles, ignored instructions, and avoided responsibility. But this time something changed. The quiet student, as always, approached the task calmly. He helped organize his group, listening to each member, encouraging them gently. And little by little, the rest of the group followed his lead. The teacher moved quietly among the groups, observing without interrupting. It was remarkable to see students who had been disengaged before now contributing ideas. The energy wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was guided by the quiet student, who hadn't even realized how much influence he had. By the end of the week, the teacher noticed something else. Other students, even the ones who had once seemed impossible to reach, were looking at the quiet student differently. They weren't mocking him. They weren't ignoring him. They were noticing him, and in noticing him, they were noticing the possibility of themselves. During a short break, the teacher approached the quiet student. "I see what you're doing," they said softly. "You're helping everyone work together." The student looked up, surprised, and shook his head. "I'm just trying," he said quietly. "I like when we can get along." The teacher smiled. "Sometimes trying is more than enough. Sometimes it's everything." That afternoon, the teacher stayed late to prepare for the next day's lesson. They weren't tired in the same way they had been before. The exhaustion that came from constant frustration had lifted, replaced by something lighter: hope, purpose, even excitement. They thought about the quiet student, about how he had transformed not just the classroom but their own perspective. The next day brought another surprise. The teacher had asked the students to share a small piece of writing in pairs. Normally, the quiet student would have been hesitant, but this time he shared openly. And something remarkable happened. Other students, inspired by his willingness to speak, began sharing too. They laughed, they debated, they listened. The classroom was still noisy, but it was the kind of noise that meant engagement, not rebellion. The teacher noticed that for the first time in months, they didn't feel drained by the day. They felt energized. The classroom wasn't perfect, but it was alive in a way that it hadn't been in a long time. And the quiet student was at the center, not commanding attention, not seeking approval, just quietly guiding others with his example. Later that week, the school held a small parent-teacher meeting. The teacher was nervous, worried that the progress in the classroom wouldn't be visible to others. But when parents arrived, many mentioned changes they had noticed in their children. Students who had been disengaged were talking about school at home, even looking forward to lessons. The teacher realized that change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't always come in dramatic moments. Sometimes it was slow, subtle, and quiet. Back in the classroom, the quiet student continued to influence the group. He didn't ask for praise, he didn't seek attention, he simply did what felt right. And the teacher learned an important lesson. Sometimes, the most impactful change comes from those who are least noticed, those who act without expectation, those who simply try. By the end of the week, the teacher felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. Some students would still challenge them. Some days would still feel impossible. But now they had proof that one person, one quiet student, could change the energy of a whole room. The quiet student didn't realize it yet, but he had become more than just a student. He was a guide, a spark, a reminder of why teaching mattered. And for the first time in a long time, the teacher felt that same spark inside themselves again. That night, As the teacher sat alone reflecting on the week, they realized something important. Teaching wasn't about controlling every moment or winning every argument. It was about connection. It was about noticing the small sparks in the room and helping them grow. It was about hope, patience, and quiet influence. The school week began with a tension that felt different than before. The teacher walked into the classroom, noticing a subtle shift in the air. Students weren't perfectly quiet, but there was a sense of purpose now. Some whispered ideas to each other, others shared notes, and the restless energy had softened into curiosity. It was the quiet student, as always, who seemed to anchor the room. That day, the teacher introduced a big project. It was something that would take days to complete. A group presentation on a topic the students chose themselves. Normally, this would have caused groans, eye rolls, and arguments. But the quiet student quietly raised his hand, volunteering to lead a group. The teacher hesitated for a moment, surprised. They weren't used to seeing him step forward like this. When the group gathered around him, the other students looked uncertain. Some were skeptical. But the quiet student spoke calmly, clearly, and simply. He divided tasks fairly, listened to everyone's ideas, and encouraged participation. The teacher watched from the back of the room, astonished. Slowly, the others began to follow his lead. By the end of the class, the group had a plan, and for the first time, the teacher realized that leadership didn't have to be loud or forceful. Sometimes it could be quiet, steady, and thoughtful. Over the next few days, the classroom continued to transform. Groups worked together more smoothly than the teacher had ever seen. Even students who normally refused to participate were starting to contribute. The quiet student remained the anchor, guiding with patience and a calm confidence that seemed to inspire others. During one class discussion, a usually disruptive student made a sarcastic comment. Before chaos could erupt, the quiet student responded, not with anger but with understanding. He reframed the comment in a positive way, turning it into a point that helped the whole group. The teacher nearly choked back tears. This student, who had once been invisible, had become a quiet force of change in the room. The teacher began to notice something else too. Their own confidence was returning. They spoke with more clarity and warmth, encouraged participation, and no longer felt drained by every interaction. The energy in the room had shifted, and it was contagious. Other teachers began to notice the change as well, asking what had happened in this classroom. The teacher only smiled, knowing the answer. It wasn't their strategy alone. It was the quiet student who had sparked it all. By the end of the week, the group presentations began. The quiet students group went first. They presented with confidence, creativity, and teamwork. Every member contributed, and the audience, both students and teachers, applauded genuinely. The teacher felt a swell of pride that went beyond the grades. They realized this was more than a successful project. It was a transformation in the classroom itself. The quiet student, standing at the front, never sought attention or praise. He simply led with patience and calm confidence. And in doing so, he showed everyone, students and teacher alike, that sometimes the quietest voice can make the biggest difference. After the presentations, the teacher stayed behind with the quiet student for a moment. "You did something incredible," they said softly. The student only smiled faintly, shrugged, and walked away. The teacher realized that this wasn't about recognition for him. It was about the impact he had on others, quietly and steadily every day. That evening, the teacher reflected on the week. They remembered the note that had started it all and smiled. One small gesture, one student willing to try, had changed everything. It was a lesson the teacher would never forget. Sometimes change comes quietly, patiently, and from the places you least expect. The classroom was no longer a place of constant struggle. It was a place of learning, connection, and growth. And it all began because one quiet student believed in his own small way that he could make a difference. The weeks passed, and the classroom continued to transform in ways the teacher had never imagined. It wasn't perfect, there were still challenges, late homework, whispered arguments, but the energy had changed completely. Students were no longer just bodies and desks. They were participants, thinkers, collaborators. And at the heart of it, guiding quietly, was the same student who had first given the teacher hope. One day, the school announced an open classroom day. Parents and other teachers would visit to see lessons in action. Normally, this would have made the teacher nervous, but now they felt a strange calm. Not because everything was perfect, but because they knew the classroom's heart was steady. When visitors arrived, the quiet students group was in the middle of a discussion for their next project. He listened to every idea carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and encouraged each member to contribute. The room buzzed not with chaos but with energy, focus, and curiosity. Parents and teachers watched, impressed. Some even whispered to each other about how well the students were working together. After the session, the teacher spoke to the visitors, feeling proud but humble. "It's not about me," they said quietly. "It's about the students, and sometimes one student can inspire change for everyone." They thought about the quiet student, standing calmly, leading without demanding attention. It was true. Without his steady presence, the room might have fallen back into the old chaos. Later that day, the teacher stayed after class, reflecting on how far they had come. Just a few months ago, they had considered quitting. Every morning felt like a battle, every lesson a struggle. Now the classroom felt alive in a way they hadn't felt in years. Students were learning, connecting, growing. And the quiet student, who had once seemed invisible, had changed everything. The student approached after everyone else had left, holding a small piece of paper. The teacher smiled, recognizing the familiar gesture. "Thank you," the student said softly, "for not giving up." The teacher's heart lifted. "No," they said gently. "Thank you. You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." For the first time in months, the teacher truly felt seen. Not by administrators, not by other teachers, but by someone who mattered most, a student. And they realized something profound. Teaching wasn't about control or perfection. It was about connection, patience, and noticing the small things. It was about the quiet moments that could grow into something powerful. In the following months, the classroom continued to thrive. Other students began to step up, inspired by the quiet student's example. Participation increased, respect grew, and even the most challenging students began to engage. Test scores improved, yes, but the real transformation was something deeper. The teacher had regained their spark, and the classroom had become a place of learning, growth, and trust. The quiet student never sought praise. He didn't ask for attention. He simply did what he could day by day, quietly making a difference. And in doing so, he had saved more than a classroom. He had saved a teacher's hope, a teacher's purpose, and in a way, a teacher's life. The teacher often thought back to the first note the student had given them, the simple words of encouragement. They kept it in a drawer, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest gestures can change everything. One quiet student had taught them the most important lesson of all. That hope, patience, and care, no matter how small, can ripple outward and transform lives. And so, the classroom became a place where students weren't just learning from textbooks. They were learning from each other, from patience, from kindness, and from the quiet courage of someone who believed that even small actions could make a difference. And the teacher? They found themselves believing again, feeling alive in the classroom, grateful for the student who had reminded them why they started this journey in the first place. The story didn't end with applause or awards. It ended quietly in the steady rhythm of a classroom filled with curiosity, respect, and hope. And that was enough. Months had passed since the classroom had begun to transform. What had started as small, quiet moments had now grown into something bigger, though not perfect. The teacher still faced challenges. Students argued, homework was late, and there were days when exhaustion weighed heavily on their shoulders. But now those struggles felt different. They were challenges to overcome, not walls to stop them. The quiet student continued to be a steady presence. He never sought attention, never demanded praise, yet his influence rippled outward in ways the teacher had never expected. Other students, inspired by his calm confidence, started to step up on their own. One by one, voices that had been silent for years began to speak. Hands went up more often. Ideas were shared. Students listened to each other instead of talking over each other. The teacher began to notice subtle but meaningful changes. Students who had previously been disengaged began helping each other. A student who had always struggled with math was now asking questions and offering answers. The classroom, once a battlefield of noise and distraction, had become a space for learning and collaboration. And at the center of it all was the quiet student, still humble, still patient, still quietly guiding without ever trying to control the room. One day, the school announced a new initiative, a mentorship program where older students would help younger ones with studies and personal challenges. The teacher immediately thought of the quiet student. They approached him cautiously, unsure if he would be interested. "Would you like to be part of the program?" the teacher asked softly. The student hesitated, then nodded. He didn't boast or demand recognition. He simply agreed. Over the following weeks, he began working with a younger student who struggled with reading. He patiently guided the child through stories, explained words gently, and encouraged practice without ever showing frustration. The younger student's confidence began to grow, and soon he was reading aloud to the teacher, smiling with pride. Watching this unfold, the teacher felt a warmth in their chest that words could not fully capture. The quiet student was teaching more than just the content in the textbooks. He was teaching empathy, patience, and resilience. He was showing that true leadership didn't come from loud voices or aggressive behavior. It came from caring, listening, and quietly taking action. The classroom itself had become a model for other teachers. Colleagues started visiting, curious about the changes. They asked what the teacher had done differently, expecting a long list of strategies or discipline plans. But the teacher smiled and said, "It wasn't just me. It was one student who reminded everyone what it means to care." During one visit, a fellow teacher asked, "How do you keep them motivated?" The teacher looked toward the back of the room, where the quiet student was helping a group solve a problem. "Sometimes," the teacher said, "all it takes is one person who believes that change is possible." It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks. Some students resisted participation. Some days felt chaotic, and there were moments when the teacher questioned whether progress was real. But every time they felt doubt creeping in, they thought of the quiet student, calmly working, quietly encouraging, and the teacher found the strength to keep going. One afternoon, the quiet student stayed behind after class again. This time he held another small piece of paper, folded neatly. The teacher took it, curious. Written simply were the words, "Thank you for believing in us. You make it easier to try." The teacher felt tears prick at the corners of their eyes. It wasn't just about encouragement. It was about recognition that the teacher's efforts mattered, that their belief in students had a ripple effect, shaping not only one student but the whole classroom. Inspired, the teacher began to experiment with new ways to engage the students further. They introduced creative projects, discussions about real-life problems, and opportunities for leadership. And every time, the quiet student naturally became a role model, showing how patience and focus could make difficult tasks achievable. The quiet student also started to connect with peers outside the classroom. At lunch, he helped other students who struggled socially. On group assignments, he mediated disagreements, helping classmates understand each other's perspectives. Slowly, the culture of the classroom spread beyond the walls. Other teachers noticed students arriving more prepared, collaborating better, and showing unexpected confidence. The teacher often reflected on how fragile everything had been just months before. They remembered the mornings when walking into the classroom felt like facing a storm, the nights spent staring at empty lesson plans, and the quiet desperation that had almost made them give up. And now, seeing the classroom alive with curiosity, teamwork, and care, they realized how much one small spark, the quiet student, had changed everything. Even the school administration noticed. At a staff meeting, the principal mentioned the classroom as an example of how student-centered approaches could transform learning. Other teachers asked for advice, but the teacher repeated the same truth. It wasn't about strict rules or perfect strategies. It was about noticing and valuing the quiet voices, giving space for patience and care to grow, and trusting that even one person could make a difference. One day, the quiet student's efforts extended beyond the classroom. A younger child in the school had been struggling with confidence and fear of speaking in class. The quiet student approached them during recess, sitting beside them on a bench, speaking softly and encouragingly. Over weeks, that child began to participate, raise their hand, and share ideas, inspired by the quiet student's example. The teacher watched from a distance, amazed at how quietly influence could spread. The teacher began journaling again, something they hadn't done since the first tough months. They wrote about the small victories, the moments of genuine connection, and the students who were learning more than just lessons. They were learning patience, empathy, and courage. And every entry had the quiet student at its heart, the one who had sparked a change that no one could have predicted. Even as the school year drew to a close, the teacher knew this was only the beginning. The classroom had been transformed, yes, but the lessons went far beyond any textbook. The quiet student had reminded everyone that true learning isn't just about knowledge, it's about care, attention, and the willingness to try even when it feels scary or unnoticed. At the last day of school, the teacher stood at the front of the classroom, looking at the students who had once been restless and disengaged. They saw curiosity, respect, and confidence where there had been chaos. And then their eyes found the quiet student sitting calmly, smiling just a little as if to say, "We did this together." The teacher felt a rush of gratitude. They realized that teaching isn't about being perfect. It isn't about controlling every moment or winning every battle. It's about connection, patience, and recognizing that even one small person, quietly believing, can change everything. That afternoon, after the students had left, the teacher stayed behind, looking around the empty classroom. The desks were the same, the chalkboard still dusty, and the sunlight slanted across the floor. But the room felt alive. It was no longer a place of struggle. It was a place of growth, hope, and quiet strength. And it had all started with one student who simply cared, listened, and acted without demanding attention. The teacher knew this was more than a classroom story. It was a lesson in life. Sometimes it doesn't take a crowd, a speech, or a grand gesture to make a difference. Sometimes it takes one quiet person, one small act of courage, one willingness to believe in someone else to change everything. And so, the teacher closed the classroom door that day, carrying with them not just lesson plans, but the knowledge that hope could be found in the quietest places, and that every student, no matter how quiet or unnoticed, had the power to transform lives. It was the quiet student, after all, who had reminded the teacher why they began teaching in the first place, and that lesson would stay with them forever.